The rope creaked in the desert wind, casting shadows that danced like death across Toby's pale face. Evelyn pressed against the saloon's weathered wall, her heart hammering as the mob surged forward, their voices a cacophony of bloodlust that made her stomach turn. "String him up," Morrison bellowed, his blacksmith's arms gleaming with sweat and fury. "Thieving scum deserves to swing." Her brother stood on the makeshift gallows platform, hands bound, 19 years old, and trembling like a wounded colt. The noose hung inches from his neck, waiting. Sheriff Curtis adjusted his star with theatrical precision, savoring the moment like fine whiskey. "Any last words, boy?" Toby's eyes found hers through the crowd. Those same green eyes that had looked up at her when he was 7, asking why their mama wouldn't wake up anymore. The memory hit her like a physical blow, so vivid she could smell the wildflowers they'd picked for Mama's grave. Hear Toby's broken whisper, "Evie, are we orphans now?" She'd held him, then promised him they'd always have each other, promised she'd never let anything happen to him. "Stop!" The word tore from her throat before she could think. The crowd turned as she stumbled forward, dust swirling around her boots. "He didn't steal anything, you know. Toby wouldn't hurt a fly." Curtis smiled, cold as winter moonlight. "Well, well, sister's here to watch." His deputy, Lane Morrison, stepped closer to the rope. Lane's eyes held something darker than justice, something that made Evelyn's skin crawl. "Please," she gasped, reaching the platform's edge. "If you have to hang someone, hang me instead." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Curtis tilted his head, like a curious vulture. "Now that's interesting. What makes you think we'd want to trade?" Before she could answer, gunshots cracked through the air. The crowd scattered like startled birds as a figure staggered into the square, blood streaming from his shoulder Colt .45, smoking in his grip. Boone Mackenzie, the outlaw, half the territory was hunting, grinned through teeth stained red. "Well, hell, Curtis," he wheezed, swaying on his feet. "Looks like you started the party without me." His eyes found Evelyn's, and something passed between them, quick as lightning. "If you're gonna kill her, might as well let me die with her. Been looking for a good way to go out." Curtis's smile widened. "2 problems, 1 rope. Perfect." But as the sheriff reached for his gun, Evelyn saw something the others missed. Boone's left hand, hidden from Curtis's view, held a small brass key. The key to the mine's old equipment shed where they'd planned to meet if everything went wrong, where their desperate plan would either save Toby's life or damn them all. The trap was set. Now they had to spring it without getting themselves killed. 3 days earlier, Perdition Creek had been just another dying frontier town, clinging to life in the shadow of the Sangre Mountains. The town's lifeblood flowed from the Lucky Strike mine, where men descended into darkness each dawn and emerged each dusk covered in dust and desperation. But Perdition Creek held one tradition that set it apart from every other settlement in the Territory Desert Water Day. Every spring, when the desert bloomed with impossible wildflowers, the town celebrated the miracle that had saved them during the Great Drought of '71. A mysterious woman, they said, had appeared during their darkest hour and led them to a hidden spring deep in Hawks Canyon. The Desert Woman, as legend named her, vanished as suddenly as she'd come, leaving only wildflowers in her footprints and clear sweet water flowing from stone. Evelyn had grown up hearing that story told in her mother's soft voice beside their hearth. "She looked just like you, Evie," Mama would whisper, brushing Evelyn's dark hair. "Green eyes like spring water, brave as any man. They say she'll return when the town needs her most." Now 24 years old and working herself to the bone as Perdition Creek's only schoolteacher, Evelyn wondered if the Desert Woman had been nothing but a beautiful lie. Because if she was real, if she truly came when needed most, where was she now? Toby worked the mine's surface operations, loading ore carts and maintaining equipment. He was good with his hands, gentle with animals, and had never stolen so much as an apple in his life. Which made Sheriff Curtis's accusations all the more absurd. $50 missing from the mine office. Curtis had announced 3 days ago, dragging Toby from their small cabin by his collar. Security box was opened with his key. That's impossible, Evelyn had protested, but Curtis's deputy Lane Morrison was already snapping iron shackles around Toby's wrists. Lane's touch lingered too long on her brother's skin, his pale eyes holding secrets that made Evelyn's stomach turn. "Save it, schoolmarm," Curtis sneered. "Boys guilty as sin. Trial's tomorrow, hanging the day after." But there would be no real trial, Evelyn knew. Curtis ran Perdition Creek like his personal kingdom, and Lane served as his enforcer. The two men had grown rich while the town grew poor, and anyone who questioned their methods had a habit of disappearing into the desert. That night, desperate and alone, Evelyn had sought out the only man in the territory, with reason to hate Sheriff Curtis as much as she did. Boone Mackenzie lived like a ghost out in the abandoned settlements scattered throughout the Sangre foothills, striking at Curtis's supply convoys and vanishing before pursuit could find him. She'd found him camped in the ruins of San Sebastian and the ghost town where Curtis had massacred a family of Mexican settlers 5 years ago. Boone sat beside a dying fire, cleaning his weapons with the methodical care of a man who'd lived too long on borrowed time. "You're either very brave or very stupid coming here alone," he'd said without looking up from his pistol. "My brother's going to hang for something he didn't do," she'd replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Curtis and Lane are setting him up." "Curtis sets up lots of people. What makes your brother special?" "Nothing. That's the point." She'd stepped closer to the fire, letting him see her face clearly. "But I know you've been watching them. I know you're planning something." Boone had looked up then, studying her with eyes like winter sky. "What makes you think I'd risk my neck for some farm boy I've never met?" "Because Curtis killed your sister." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. When Boone finally spoke, his voice was soft as a grave whisper. "What do you know about my sister?" "I know her name was Maria. I know she was 16 when she disappeared. And I know Curtis told everyone she ran off with a traveling merchant. But you found her body in Devil's Canyon with a bullet in her head." Boone's hand tightened on his gun. "How do you know that?" "Because I found the letter you wrote to the territorial marshal. The one that never got sent because the mail carrier works for Curtis." Evelyn pulled the crumpled paper from her coat. "I teach children to read, Mr. Mackenzie. Sometimes they bring me things they find. Tommy Garrett found this blowing through the cemetery last month. The letter detailed everything: Maria's murder, Curtis's involvement, the corruption that ran through Perdition Creek like poison through water." Boone had poured his heart onto that page, seeking justice for the sister who'd been his only family. "What do you want from me?" he'd asked finally. "Help me save Toby, and I'll help you destroy Curtis. I work alone. Then you'll die alone, and Maria will never have justice." Evelyn leaned forward, letting him see the desperation in her eyes. "But together, we might actually win." That's how she'd ended up here, watching her brother face the gallows, while Boone played his part in their desperate gambit. The plan was simple: create enough chaos to get Toby away from the rope, then disappear into the maze of abandoned mine shafts that honeycombed the mountains. Simple plans, Evelyn had learned, were usually the ones that got people killed. Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's widow, caught her eye from the crowd. The older woman's face was grim, but she gave an almost imperceptible nod. Henderson, who ran the general store, touched his hat brim in acknowledgement. Even Morrison, despite his shouting, avoided looking directly at Curtis when he thought the sheriff wasn't watching. The town was ready to turn. They just needed the right moment, the right revelation. Curtis and Lane had made enemies of everyone they couldn't buy or intimidate, and Evelyn was betting that fear could be turned to fury with the right spark. Boone staggered closer to the platform, his gun wavering in his grip. Blood loss was making him weak, but his eyes remained sharp, calculating. "Come on, Curtis, let's finish this dance." The sheriff drew his pistol, smiling like a cat with cream. "My pleasure, Mackenzie. Been looking forward to putting you down." But as Curtis raised his gun, Evelyn saw Lane's hand move to his own weapon. Not to support his boss, but to aim at Curtis's back. The deputy's pale eyes held something she'd never seen before: naked ambition and the cold willingness to kill for it. The trap within the trap was about to spring, and Evelyn realized their simple plan had just become deadly complicated. The gunshot that followed wasn't the one anyone expected. Curtis spun around his face, a mask of shock, as Lane's smoking pistol pointed at his chest. What the hell? The sheriff's words died as Lane's second shot took him high in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. "Change of leadership, boss," Lane announced calmly to the stunned crowd. "Town needs someone who can make the hard decisions." Chaos erupted. The crowd scattered in every direction as Lane's hired men emerged from their hiding spots around the square, weapons drawn. Morrison dove behind his forge, Mrs. Patterson scrambled for the church, and Henderson slammed the general store's door shut with a bang that echoed like another gunshot. In the confusion, Boone lunged forward despite his wounds, tackling the two men holding Toby's rope. They went down in a tangle of limbs and curses, the noose swinging wildly as Toby fought against his bonds. "Evie," he screamed, "get out of here." But Evelyn was already moving, not away from danger, but toward it. She'd spotted something during the melee that made her blood run cold. The small brass key had fallen from Boone's grip, and Lane was reaching for it with a knowing smile. "Looking for this schoolmarm." Lane held up the key, his pale eyes dancing with malicious joy. "Did you really think we didn't know about your little midnight meetings, about your pathetic plan?" Horror washed over Evelyn like ice water. If Lane knew about the key, knew about their plan, then he'd known all along. This whole thing, the execution, Boone's dramatic appearance, even Curtis's betrayal, it was all part of Lane's design. "Surprised?" Lane's smile widened. "I've been watching you, Evelyn, watching and waiting. See, Curtis was useful for a while, but he lacked vision. He thought small, kept to petty corruption and intimidation. But me, I think bigger." Boone struggled to his feet, blood streaming from a fresh wound on his forehead. "You son of a bitch. This was all you." "Oh, it gets better." Lane laughed, backing toward the mine office with the key clutched in his fist. "See, there never was $50 missing from that security box. I planted evidence to frame poor Toby here. Had to give our schoolmarm a reason to come running to the famous Boone Mackenzie." "Why?" Evelyn gasped, her world tilting as understanding dawned. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted, Evelyn. You." Lane's voice dropped to an intimate whisper that made her skin crawl. "Ever since you came back from that fancy teacher's college in Denver, ever since you started filling these children's heads with ideas about justice and fairness. You're going to be mine, whether you want to or not. Like hell." Boone snarled, raising his gun despite the blood loss making his hands shake. Lane's men had him surrounded before he could fire. 6 rifles trained on his chest, hammers cocked and ready. "I don't think so, Mackenzie. You've served your purpose. Played the villain so perfectly that when I kill you, I'll be a hero. The deputy who saved the town from the notorious Outlaw." On the platform, Toby had managed to work one hand free of his bonds. But 2 of Lane's men still held the rope, and the noose remained around his neck. One sharp tug, and her brother would dance in the desert air. "Here's how this plays out." Lane continued, his voice carrying across the square with theatrical authority. Mackenzie dies resisting arrest. Poor Sheriff Curtis succumbs to his wounds, tragic victim of outlaw violence. And young Toby, well, he hangs for his crimes, justice served. And me? Evelyn asked, though she already knew the answer. You disappear, overcome with grief, unable to bear the loss of your brother. You wander into the desert and are never seen again. Very sad. Very romantic. Lane's smile turned predatory. Of course, you'll actually be living in a very comfortable cabin I've prepared up in Hawks Canyon. You'll learn to appreciate your new situation, given time. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Lane had orchestrated everything: Toby's frame-up, Boone's involvement, even Curtis's betrayal. He'd manipulated them all like pieces on a chessboard, and now he was ready to claim his prize. But Evelyn hadn't spent 5 years teaching children without learning that even the best-laid plans had weaknesses. Lane's weakness was his arrogance, his need to explain his cleverness. And while he'd been gloating, she'd been watching. Mrs. Patterson hadn't run far. The preacher's widow crouched behind a water barrel near the church, but her hands weren't empty. She held something that glinted in the sunlight, a mirror angled to catch and reflect the light toward the mountains, toward the old mine entrance where they'd cached supplies for their escape. A signal, the backup plan within the backup plan. Henderson hadn't hidden in his store either. The shopkeeper's face appeared briefly in his window, and Evelyn saw him raise his hand, fingers spread wide. 5 minutes. That's how long she needed to keep Lane talking. Even Morrison, despite his earlier bloodthirsty shouting, had positioned himself strategically. The blacksmith's forge was loaded with coal and ready to burn. If things went wrong, very wrong, he could create a smoke screen thick enough to blind half the territory. The town might be afraid of Lane, but they weren't beaten. Not yet. You're wrong about one thing, Evelyn said, stepping closer despite the rifles trained on her friends. This isn't your story, Lane. It's mine. Is that so? He raised an eyebrow, amused. And how do you figure that, schoolmarm? Because I know what you don't know. I know about the woman in the cabin. For the first time, Lane's confident mask slipped. What woman? The one you've been keeping in Hawks Canyon. The one you told everyone died years ago. Evelyn watched his face pale and pressed her advantage. I know about the Crimson Rose Consortium, Lane. I know about the ledger. The color drained from Lane's face completely. Behind him, his men shifted nervously, clearly hearing things they'd never been told. The rifles wavered slightly as doubt crept into their ranks. You're bluffing, Lane said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Am I? Evelyn smiled grimly. Then I guess we'll find out when this is over. Won't we, brother? The last word hit Lane like a physical blow. His gun hand trembled as the truth she'd been hiding crashed over him like a flash flood in the desert. The woman in the cabin wasn't just any prisoner. She was family. And suddenly, everything Lane thought he knew about his carefully crafted plan began to crumble like sand castles in the wind. You're lying, Lane whispered, but his voice cracked like thin ice. She's dead. I buried her myself. You buried an empty coffin, Evelyn replied, her heart hammering as she played the most dangerous bluff of her life. Filled with rocks and weighted down with guilt. But Sarah Mackenzie is very much alive. The name hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Sarah Mackenzie Boone's sister, the girl who'd vanished 3 years ago, supposedly killed by Curtis, but secretly held prisoner by Lane. The girl whose death had driven Boone to become an outlaw, seeking vengeance against the wrong man. Sarah. Boone's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across the square like a gunshot. His blue eyes clouded with pain, and blood loss suddenly blazed with hope and fury. "You son of a bitch, you've had her all this time." Lane's carefully constructed world was collapsing, and Evelyn could see him scrambling to regain control. Even if that were true, which it's not, what makes you think you can prove it? "Because I found your insurance policy." Evelyn reached slowly into her coat, making sure Lane's men could see her hands. She pulled out a small leather journal, its pages yellow with age and use. "The ledger you keep hidden in the mine office. The one that lists every woman you and Curtis have sold to work camps in California." The gasps from the crowd were audible now. Mrs. Patterson stumbled forward, her face white as death. "Sold? What do you mean, sold?" "The Crimson Rose Consortium," Evelyn said, opening the journal with trembling fingers. "A network of corrupt officials and businessmen who traffic women to mining camps and factories where no one asks questions about missing persons." She looked up, meeting the eyes of townsfolk who were beginning to understand. "Every young woman who's run off in the past 5 years, every girl who supposedly eloped with traveling merchants or died of fever, they were all sold." Henderson pushed open his store door, his face grim. "My niece, Rachel. You said she died of consumption." "Page 47. Evelyn called out, her voice carrying clearly. "Rachel Henderson, age 17, sold to the Goldfield Mining Company for $200. Morrison's hammer fell from his grip with a clang that echoed like a bell. "Mary Elizabeth. My daughter, Mary Elizabeth." Page 62. Mary Morrison, age 19, sold to the Sacramento textile mill for $150. More voices rose from the crowd, names of daughters, sisters, wives, who'd vanished over the years. Each name Evelyn read from the ledger was another nail in Lane's coffin, another thread of his control unraveling. But Lane was far from finished. His pale eyes darted from face to face, calculating odds, measuring escape routes. When his gaze fell on Toby, still trapped on the platform with the noose around his neck, his smile returned. "Interesting reading, school marm. But you're forgetting something important." He gestured to his men, and they tightened their grip on the rope. "I still hold all the cards that matter." "Do you?" Evelyn asked. She'd been watching the crowd carefully, and she could see the change in their faces. Fear was transforming into fury, confusion into determination. "Look around, Lane. Really look." Lane glanced over his shoulder and froze. His 6 hired guns were still in position, still had their weapons trained on Boone in the crowd. But the townsfolk weren't cowering anymore. They were surrounding the square, moving with the careful coordination of people who'd finally seen enough. Morrison hefted his sledgehammer. Henderson emerged from his store carrying a hunting rifle. Mrs. Patterson stood beside the church steps with the late Reverend's old cavalry saber. Even the children were involved. Tommy Garrett and his friends had positioned themselves with slingshots ready to create chaos if the adults needed a distraction. "You're outnumbered, Lane," Evelyn said quietly. "Even if you kill all of us, the ledger's already been copied. Henderson's been busy these past few days." "3 copies," Henderson confirmed grimly. "One going to the territorial marshal, one to the governor, and one to that newspaper editor in Santa Fe who's been asking questions about missing women." Lane's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of desperate cunning that made Evelyn's skin crawl. "You think you're so clever, don't you, school marm, but you're forgetting something." He whistled sharply, and more figures emerged from hiding spots around the town. Not just his usual hired thugs, but men in better clothes. Men with the soft hands of clerks and the hard eyes of killers. The Crimson Rose Consortium hadn't just sent Lane to run their operation in Perdition Creek. They'd sent an army. 12 more men, Lane announced with satisfaction. All loyal to the consortium, all very experienced at cleaning up loose ends. Even if your copies of the ledger reach their destinations, who's going to believe the word of a dead schoolteacher against respected businessmen? The tide was turning again. The townsfolk might outnumber Lane's original men, but they were farmers and shopkeepers, not gunfighters. Against professional killers, courage might not be enough. But Evelyn had one more card to play, one final desperate gambit that would either save them all or get everyone killed. "You're right," she said, closing the ledger and tucking it back into her coat. "We can't win a fight against professional killers." "Finally some sense," Lane sneered. "But we don't have to win a fight." Evelyn smiled grimly. "Because in about 30 seconds, half the territorial militia is going to ride into this square, and they're going to want answers about why a town full of dead bodies has Crimson Rose calling cards in their pockets." Lane's confidence faltered. "You're bluffing again." "Am I? Tell me, Lane, when was the last time you checked the telegraph office?" The sound that reached them then was faint, but unmistakable horses' hooves, lots of them coming fast from the direction of the main trail. Lane's face went white as he realized the truth. Mrs. Patterson's mirror hadn't just been signaling the mountains. It had been reflecting sunlight toward the territorial cavalry outpost where Henderson's son worked as a telegrapher. The copies of the ledger weren't just insurance, they were bait designed to bring federal law enforcement running. "Checkmate," Evelyn whispered. But Lane Morrison was far from finished. As the sound of approaching cavalry grew louder, his face twisted with rage and desperation. If he was going down, he was taking everyone with him. "Kill them all," he screamed. The square erupted in gunfire and chaos. But in the confusion of smoke and shouting, Evelyn had lost sight of the most important thing. Toby was still on that platform, still wearing that noose, and Lane's men still controlled the rope. As bullets flew and people screamed, she realized their victory might come too late to save the person who mattered most. The first volley of gunfire shattered the morning air like breaking glass. Evelyn dove behind the schoolhouse steps as bullets chewed splinters from the wooden boards above her head. Across the square, Morrison swung his hammer with devastating effect, catching one of Lane's gunmen across the jaw and dropping him like a stone. Mrs. Patterson had taken cover behind a water trough, the Reverend's cavalry saber gleaming in her weathered hands. But the professional killers Lane had summoned were earning their pay. They moved with military precision, taking defensive positions and laying down withering covering fire. Henderson cried out as a bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him against his storefront. Tommy Garrett's father went down, clutching his leg, blood seeping between his fingers. Through the chaos, Evelyn could see Toby on the platform, struggling desperately against his bonds, as the two men holding his rope tried to decide whether to follow Lane's kill order or preserve their only bargaining chip. The noose swayed with each of his movements, tightening dangerously around his throat. "Evie." Boone's voice cut through the gunfire. The outlaw was pinned behind an overturned wagon, bleeding from multiple wounds, but still fighting. "The dynamite Morrison's shed." She followed his pointing finger and understood immediately. The blacksmith kept blasting supplies for the mine in a small building behind his forge. If they could reach it, they might level the playing field literally. But getting there meant crossing 30 yards of open ground under murderous crossfire. Suicidal odds, but Toby was running out of time. One of the men holding his rope was already reaching for his sidearm, clearly deciding that a dead hostage was better than a living liability. Evelyn sprinted from cover, zigzagging as bullets whined around her like angry hornets. A slug tore through her skirt, another burned across her shoulder, leaving a line of fire in its wake. Morrison saw her coming and provided cover, hurling chunks of hot iron from his forge with devastating accuracy. She slammed into the shed door, fumbling with the latch as splinters exploded around her. Inside, sticks of dynamite lay stacked like cordwood next to coils of fuse and blasting caps. Her hands shook as she grabbed what she needed, not enough to level the town, but enough to shake everyone's confidence. The sound of approaching horses was louder now, maybe 2 minutes away. But 2 minutes might as well be 2 hours if Toby died in the next 30 seconds. She lit a short fuse and hurled the first stick toward Lane's position behind the mine office. The explosion shattered windows and sent his men diving for better cover. The second stick landed near the platform, and the concussion knocked both rope holders to their knees. "Now!" she screamed. Boone erupted from behind his wagon like a man possessed, his guns blazing as he charged toward the platform. Blood streamed from a dozen wounds, but fury kept him upright, kept him moving. Mrs. Patterson rose from her cover with a rebel yell that would have made her late husband proud, the cavalry saber flashing as she carved through Lane's confused ranks. But it was Morrison who reached Toby first. The blacksmith's massive frame absorbed 3 bullets without slowing, and his hammer crushed the skull of the nearest rope holder like an eggshell. The second man tried to draw his pistol, but Toby, finally free of his bonds, grabbed the noose around his own neck and used it to strangle his captor. "Get off the platform," Boone yelled, reaching them just as reinforcements tried to retake the gallows. His Colts spoke in perfect synchronization, dropping 2 men before they could raise their rifles. Toby stumbled down the platform steps, the noose finally off his neck, gasping and coughing but alive. Evelyn reached him just as the cavalry thundered into the square, their blue uniforms and gleaming sabers, a welcome sight after so much blood and chaos. "Federal marshals!" The lead rider shouted, his voice carrying over the gunfire. "Everyone drop your weapons." The consortium's professional killers were good, but they weren't stupid. Facing a full troop of territorial cavalry, they began throwing down their guns and raising their hands. Even Lane's original crew was surrendering, their loyalty evaporating when faced with federal justice. But Lane Morrison himself was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" Evelyn gasped, looking around wildly. "Where's Lane?" "There." Toby pointed toward the mine entrance, where a lone figure was disappearing into the darkness of the main shaft. "He's running for the canyon." The mine tunnels connected to a network of natural caves that wound through the mountains like arteries. A man who knew those passages could disappear for months, emerging anywhere within 50 miles. And Lane knew them better than anyone. He'd been using them to transport his human cargo for years. "He's getting away," Boone snarled, checking his weapons. "And if he reaches those caves, he'll disappear forever," Evelyn finished, "along with any chance of finding the women he's taken." The federal marshal approached them, his face grim beneath his campaign hat. "Are you Evelyn Carter? We received your telegram about the Crimson Rose Consortium." "The leader just went into the mine," she said urgently. "If you don't stop him now." "My orders are to secure the town and arrest everyone involved." The marshal interrupted. "I can't risk my men in those tunnels without proper equipment and guides." "Then I'll go," Boone said simply. "You're under arrest too, Mackenzie," the marshal replied. "You're wanted for robbery and murder across 3 territories. Charges I'll face gladly if it means stopping Lane Morrison." Boone met the marshal's eyes steadily. "But my sister's down there somewhere, along with God knows how many other women. Are you willing to let them die while you follow procedure?" The marshal hesitated, clearly torn between duty and justice. In that moment of uncertainty, Evelyn made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "I'm going with him," she announced. "Like hell you are." Toby grabbed her arm. "I just got you back, Evie. I'm not losing you to those tunnels." She looked into her brother's eyes, seeing the frightened boy who'd asked if they were orphans, and the young man who just faced death with courage she'd never known he possessed. "I have to, Toby. Lane won't stop with us. He'll disappear, start over somewhere else, and more families will be destroyed." "Then I'm coming too." "No." Her voice was gentle but final. "You're staying here where it's safe, where you can help rebuild what Lane destroyed." Before anyone could stop her, she grabbed a mining lamp and a coil of rope from the equipment shed and started toward the dark mouth of the mine. Behind her, she heard Boone's boots following, heard the marshal cursing and giving orders to his men. But ahead lay only darkness, and somewhere in that darkness waited a man who'd already proven he'd rather see the world burn than lose control of it. The final confrontation was about to begin, deep in the belly of the mountain, where no law existed except the oldest law of all survival. The mine's darkness swallowed them like a living thing. Evelyn's lamp cast a feeble circle of light that barely pushed back the crushing black, and every footstep echoed with hollow menace in the narrow tunnel. Beside her, Boone moved with the careful silence of a man who'd spent years staying one step ahead of death. But she could hear his labored breathing, could smell the blood still seeping from his wounds. "You sure about this?" he whispered as they reached the first junction. 3 tunnels branched off into the mountain's heart, each disappearing into impenetrable darkness. "No," Evelyn admitted, studying the dusty floor for signs of passage. "But Lane knows these tunnels better than we do. If we wait for the cavalry to organize a proper search, he'll be long gone." Boot prints in the dust led toward the center tunnel, the one that sloped deepest into the mountain. Evelyn had heard the miners talk about this shaft. It connected to the old Spanish workings tunnels that had been carved centuries ago by conquistadors seeking gold. If Lane reached those ancient passages, he could emerge anywhere in the Sangre Range. They followed the trail deeper past abandoned equipment and shored up cave-ins, past seams of silver ore that glittered like stars in the lamplight. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and Evelyn found herself fighting claustrophobia as the tunnel walls seemed to press closer with each step. "Wait," Boone whispered, grabbing her arm. She froze, listening. From somewhere ahead came the sound of voices echoing strangely in the confined space. Lane wasn't alone. He'd managed to rally some of his men, probably the ones who'd escaped during the chaos in the square. "How many?" she breathed. Boone closed his eyes, tilting his head like a hunting wolf. 3, maybe 4. They're arguing about something." They crept forward until the voices became clearer. Lane's pale tones, high with stress and fury, dominated the conversation. "Told you idiots to bring the horses around to Devil's Canyon? Now we're trapped in here like rats." "Boss, maybe we should surrender," another voice suggested nervously. "Those federal boys, they might make a deal." "There are no deals." Lane's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you understand? They found the ledger. They know everything. But if we give them the women are evidence. They can identify us, testify against us." There was a pause, and when Lane spoke again, his voice was cold as winter moonlight. "They have to die. All of them." Evelyn's blood turned to ice. The women Lane had taken the girls sold to the consortium. They were here somewhere in these tunnels. And Lane was planning to murder them all rather than face justice. "Where?" Boone breathed so quietly, she almost didn't hear him. She pointed deeper into the tunnel where a faint breeze carried scents that didn't belong underground cooking fires. Human waste, the accumulated misery of people held captive. The old Spanish chambers had been converted into a prison away station where stolen women waited to be transported to their final destinations. They edged forward until light appeared ahead, not the harsh glare of electric lamps, but the softer glow of oil flames. The tunnel opened into a natural cavern, its walls carved with centuries-old Spanish inscriptions. Rough wooden cages lined one side of the chamber, and in those cages, Evelyn bit back a gasp. Dozens of women, some barely more than girls, huddled in the makeshift cells. Their clothes were filthy, their faces gaunt with hunger and despair, but their eyes held something that made her heart soar hope. They'd heard the gunfire from above, had dared to believe that rescue might be coming. Lane stood in the center of the chamber, with 3 of his men, all heavily armed. But what made Evelyn's heart stop was what he held in his hand, a stick of dynamite, with a lit fuse already burning down toward the blasting cap. "One way or another, this ends here," he announced to his men. "If we can't keep them, nobody can have them." "Boss, that's crazy," one of the gunmen protested. "If you set that off, you'll bring down the whole mountain." "Good." Lane smiled with the serene madness of a man who'd lost everything that mattered to him. "Let them dig our bodies out of the rubble. At least then we'll all go down together." The fuse was burning shorter with each second. Maybe 30 seconds before it reached the cap, maybe less. 30 seconds to save dozens of lives, to stop a madman who'd rather commit mass murder than face justice. Boone raised his pistol, but Lane was standing too close to the cages. A wild shot might hit one of the prisoners, and the dynamite would detonate anyway if he was killed. They needed a different approach, something that would get the explosive away from the women without setting it off. "Lane Morrison." Evelyn stepped into the light, her hands raised, but her voice carrying absolute authority. "Your sister wants to see you." The effect was immediate and devastating. Lane spun around his face, draining of color, the dynamite wavering in his grip. "What did you say?" "Sarah Morrison, your sister. She's alive, Lane, and she's been asking for you." "You're lying." But his voice cracked with desperate hope, with a possibility that maybe the sister he'd mourned for 3 years might still draw breath. "The cabin in Hawks Canyon. That's where you've been keeping her, isn't it? Ever since you faked her death to protect her from Curtis." Evelyn took a careful step forward, keeping her eyes locked on his. "But she's not dead, Lane. She's waiting for you." The lie came easily because it contained enough truth to be believable. There was a cabin in Hawks Canyon, and someone was being held there. And Evelyn had seen the smoke from its chimney, had found supplies cached along the trail leading to it. But whether that someone was Sarah Morrison, or just another victim of the consortium, she had no way of knowing. What mattered was that Lane believed it. The dynamite trembled in his grip as conflicting emotions warred across his face: hope, fear, desperate longing. "She told me about the scar on your shoulder." Evelyn continued, gambling everything on details she'd gleaned from conversations around town. "The one you got when you fell from the barn roof trying to rescue that stray cat. She said you cried more about the cat than your own injury." "Stop." Lane whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Please stop." "She wants to come home, Lane. But she can't do that if you're dead. If you murder all these innocent women." Evelyn risked another step closer. "Put down the dynamite. Let us help you find her." For a moment it looked like he might listen. The fuse burned down to barely an inch, but Lane's grip on the explosive loosened. His men watched in confusion as their leader wavered between madness and hope. Then Boone's shadow fell across the chamber entrance, and everything went wrong. "Sarah's dead, you son of a bitch." The outlaw snarled, his gun trained on Lane's heart. "I buried what was left of her after you and Curtis finished with her. Don't let this lying schoolmarm fill your head with false hope." The words hit Lane like physical blows. His face twisted with renewed fury as he realized He'd been manipulated, that his moment of weakness had been used against him. "You bastard," he screamed. "You self-righteous bastard." The fuse reached the blasting cap, just as Lane hurled the dynamite toward the cages. Time slowed to a crawl. Evelyn saw the lit explosive arcing through the air, saw the women in the cages scrambling away from where it would land, saw Boone diving forward in a desperate attempt to intercept it. She moved without thinking, her body acting on pure instinct. Her hand closed around the dynamite just as Boone collided with her, both of them tumbling toward the chamber's entrance as the fuse burned down to nothing. The explosion, when it came, seemed to last forever and no time at all. Light brighter than the sun filled the chamber, followed by sound louder than thunder. The mountain shook like a thing alive, and somewhere in the chaos of falling rock and screaming voices, Evelyn felt herself flying through darkness toward an uncertain fate. When the dust settled and the ringing in her ears finally stopped, she would discover that some victories came at a price too terrible to calculate, and some secrets were buried so deep that even death couldn't bring them to light. Consciousness returned, slowly accompanied by pain that felt like every bone in her body had been shattered and reassembled wrong. Evelyn lay in absolute darkness, tasting blood and dust, feeling the weight of fallen stone pressing against her legs. Somewhere nearby, water dripped with metronomic persistence, each drop echoing in what sounded like a vast space. "Boone," she whispered, her voice barely audible, even to herself. A groan answered her from perhaps 10 feet away, followed by the sound of rocks shifting as someone tried to move. "Still alive," came his ragged reply. "Barely. You. Same." She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, as fresh waves of agony crashed over her. The women. Gone. Boone's voice was flat with exhaustion and defeat. The explosion brought down half the chamber. If they weren't crushed, they're buried too deep to reach. The full horror of what had happened began to sink in. Dozens of innocent women, trapped and terrified, had died because she'd tried to be clever, because she'd thought she could talk a madman out of his madness. The weight of their death settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. Lane, dead, crushed under about 3 tons of rock. There was no satisfaction in Boone's voice, only weary emptiness. His men too, from what I can see. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, Evelyn began to make out shapes in the darkness. They were in a side tunnel that had partially collapsed, forming a small pocket of air among the rubble. Water seeped through cracks in the ceiling, creating the puddles that reflected what little light filtered down from somewhere above. But it was what lay beyond the immediate wreckage that made her breath catch. The explosion had broken through into one of the old Spanish chambers, and scattered across the floor were dozens of wooden boxes, their contents spilled like a pirate's treasure. Gold coins, jewelry, silver ingots, the accumulated wealth of the Crimson Rose Consortium's operations. And sitting propped against one of the boxes, as if placed there deliberately, was a leather satchel she recognized. Lane's personal effects, including the true ledger, not the copy she'd shown the crowd, but the original record of every transaction, every victim, every member of the consortium network. "We have to get out of here," she said, forcing herself to move, despite the pain. "That ledger won't bring back the dead," Boone finished bitterly, "but it might save the living." Evelyn crawled toward the satchel, ignoring the protests from her battered body. "This isn't just about Perdition Creek, Boone. The consortium has operations across 3 territories. Hundreds of women, maybe thousands." She reached the satchel and pulled it open with trembling fingers. Inside, along with the ledger, were maps showing safe houses, transport routes, and contact information for corrupt officials from California to Colorado. It was a complete guide to dismantling one of the largest criminal organizations in the American West. But there was something else. something that made her heart stop. At the bottom of the satchel, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a small tintype photograph. It showed a woman in her 40s with graying hair and kind eyes, standing beside a modest cabin. Written on the back in Lane's careful handwriting were the words, "Mother, Hawks Canyon, September 1885. "My God," Evelyn breathed. "What is it?" She held up the photograph with shaking hands. "I was wrong about the woman in the cabin. It's not Sarah Morrison." "Then who?" "It's my mother." The words hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Evelyn stared at the photograph, comparing the face to her childhood memories, seeing the resemblance that years of grief had obscured. Her mother, supposedly dead of fever when Evelyn was 15, was alive. Had been alive all this time, hidden away in Hawks Canyon like some shameful secret. "But that's impossible," Boone said gently. "You buried her. I've heard you talk about visiting her grave." "I buried someone." Evelyn's mind raced back through the years, examining memories she'd locked away. "But I never saw the body. Lane told us she was too sick, that we shouldn't risk catching the fever. We buried a closed coffin. Just like Sarah Morrison. Just like all the women the consortium had supposedly killed, but actually enslaved." The pattern was becoming clear, and with it came a revelation so shocking that it made the mind collapse seem trivial by comparison. "Lane isn't just some psychotic deputy," she whispered. "He's my half-brother. That's why he was obsessed with me, why he went to such elaborate lengths to orchestrate this whole situation." The pieces fell into place, with sickening clarity. Lane's father, whoever he was, had also been her mother's lover. When Eleanor Carter became pregnant with Evelyn, she'd been sent away from Perdition Creek to avoid scandal. But she'd returned years later with 2 children and a false story about her husband's death. Lane had grown up knowing he had a half-sister, but unable to acknowledge the connection. His obsession with Evelyn wasn't romantic, it was familial, the twisted need of a damaged man to claim the family he'd been denied. "We have to reach the surface," she said urgently. "My mother, if she's still alive. Even if we can climb out of here, it'll take hours to reach Hawks Canyon," Boone pointed out. "And that's assuming we don't bleed to death first." But Evelyn was already moving, driven by desperate hope and the knowledge that somewhere in the mountains, the woman who'd sung her lullabies and told her stories about the desert woman might still be drawing breath. She stuffed the ledger and photograph into her coat and began searching for a way up through the rubble. What she found was better than a way up, it was a way forward. The explosion had opened a passage into one of the old Spanish drainage tunnels, a narrow shaft that angled upward toward the surface. It would be a difficult climb, especially with their injuries, but it was possible. "Come on," she called to Boone, who was struggling to his feet. "We're not dying in this hole." "After you school, marm," he replied with something that might have been a smile. Always wanted to see how this story ends. They began the long climb toward daylight, carrying with them the evidence that would destroy the Crimson Rose Consortium, and the hope that some miracles, however small, might still be possible in a world that had seen too much darkness. Behind them, in the collapsed chamber, the bodies of Lane Morrison and his men lay buried under tons of stone. But the evil they'd served would not die with them, not unless 2 battered survivors could carry word of it into the light of day. The hardest part of their journey was just beginning. They emerged from the drainage tunnel 3 hours later, blinking like moles in the afternoon sunlight. The opening was hidden behind a stand of scrub oak on the eastern slope of the mountain, miles from where the cavalry would be searching. Evelyn's dress was torn to ribbons, her hands bloody from clawing at stone, but the leather satchel remained clutched against her chest like a lifeline. Boone looked worse. Fresh blood seeped through his shirt, from wounds that had reopened during the climb, and his face had the gray pallor of a man approaching his limits. But his eyes remained clear, focused on the trail that wound through the foothills toward Hawks Canyon. "How far?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. 5 miles, maybe 6. Evelyn helped him to his feet, feeling him lean heavily on her arm. "Can you make it? Have to?" He managed a weak smile. "Can't let you face this alone, whatever we find there." They began walking, following animal trails and old mining roads that led deeper into the wilderness. The sun was already sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. If they didn't reach the cabin before dark, they might never find it at all. As they walked, Evelyn found herself thinking about the desert woman, the legendary figure who'd saved Perdition Creek during the drought. Her mother had told that story so many times with such rich detail that it had seemed more real than memory. But now she wondered if it had been more than just a story, if her mother had been trying to tell her something important about survival, about the strength that ordinary women could find when pushed to extraordinary circumstances. "Tell me about her," Boone said suddenly. "Who?" "Your mother. What was she like?" Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, sorting through memories she'd buried beneath years of grief. "Strong. Gentle. She had a way of making everything seem possible even when we had nothing." She smiled despite the pain of remembering. "After my father died, we came to Perdition Creek, with nothing but the clothes on our backs. She took in sewing, taught children their letters, did whatever it took to keep us fed. Sounds like someone worth finding. If she's still alive. If this isn't just another of Lane's sick games." But even as she said it, Evelyn felt a growing certainty that the photograph was real, that somewhere ahead lay answers to questions she'd carried for years. Why had her mother been so fearful during those last months before her supposed death? Why had she insisted on telling Evelyn and Toby so many stories about strong women surviving impossible odds? Why had she seemed to be preparing them for something terrible? The trail grew steeper as they climbed toward Hawks Canyon, winding between towering sandstone formations that glowed like furnaces in the setting sun. Boone's breathing became more labored with each step, and twice he had to stop to rest his hand pressed to his side, where blood continued to seep through his shirt. "Leave me," he said during the second stop. "You can move faster alone." Not happening. Evelyn helped him to his feet again, ignoring his protest. "We started this together. We finish it together." As the sun touched the horizon, they finally saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from a hidden valley between two canyon walls. The cabin was there, just as Lane's photograph had shown, nestled among cottonwood trees beside a small stream. Lamplight glowed in its single window, warm and welcoming as a lighthouse beacon. But as they approached, Evelyn noticed details that made her heart sink. The cabin's door was heavily barred, its windows covered with thick wooden shutters. What she'd first taken for a cozy retreat revealed itself as something much more sinister, a prison disguised as a home. "Someone's inside," Boone whispered, pointing to shadows moving across the lamplight. "But there's a guard, too. See him by the shed." Evelyn followed his gaze and spotted a figure sitting on a stump beside a small outbuilding rifle across his knees. One of Lane's men left behind to keep watch over his human cargo. The sight filled her with cold fury, even with Lane dead, and the consortium's plans in ruins, her mother remained a prisoner. "I'll circle around back," Boone said, checking his weapons. "Give me 5 minutes, then approach from the front. Keep him talking. You can barely stand. I can shoot. That's all that matters." They separated in the gathering dusk, Evelyn working her way toward the cabin's front door, while Boone disappeared into the shadows behind the outbuildings. The guard hadn't noticed them yet. He was focused on something in the distance, probably watching for Lane's return. As she drew closer, Evelyn could hear voices from inside the cabin. A woman's voice, older and weathered, but still recognizable after all these years. Her mother alive and talking to someone. The sound made her knees weak with relief and anticipation. But there was another voice, too younger and frightened. Another prisoner, another woman stolen by the consortium's network of corruption and cruelty. How many more victims were hidden in cabins and safe houses across the territory? How many families had been torn apart by men like Lane Morrison? The guard shifted on his stump rifle, sliding across his lap. In the lamplight, Evelyn could see his face clearly young. Nervous, probably one of the local men Lane had recruited with promises of easy money. Not a professional killer like the ones in the mine, just a small-town criminal in over his head. "Evening," she called out, stepping into the open with her hands raised. "Don't suppose you've got room for one more?" The guard jumped up, rifle swinging toward her. "Who the hell are you? How'd you find this place?" "Lane sent me." She lied smoothly. "Said you might need help with the prisoners." "Lane's supposed to be back hours ago." The rifle wavered uncertainly. "Where is he?" "Dead." Boone's voice came from directly behind the guard, followed by the distinctive sound of a pistol hammer being cocked. "Along with everyone else who worked for the consortium. Now drop the rifle and step away from the cabin." The young man's shoulders sagged in defeat. The rifle fell from nerveless fingers as the full implications hit him. "Jesus," he whispered. "What am I going to do now?" "That depends," Evelyn said, pulling the cabin key from the guard's belt, "on how cooperative you're feeling." She turned toward the cabin door, her heart hammering as she fitted the key into the lock. Behind that heavy wooden barrier waited answers to questions that had haunted her for nearly a decade. The truth about her mother's disappearance, about the family secrets that had shaped her entire life. The lock clicked open. The door swung inward on silent hinges. And there, sitting beside a small table with mending in her lap, was Eleanor Carter, older, grayer, marked by years of captivity, but unmistakably alive. "Hello, Evelyn," her mother said quietly. "I wondered when you'd finally come." The reunion Evelyn had dreamed of for years was nothing like she'd imagined. There were no tears, no desperate embraces, no joyful exclamations. Just a tired woman setting down her sewing and rising from her chair with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to live with constant watchfulness. "Why?" The word came out strangled, barely audible. "Why did you let us think you were dead?" Eleanor's eyes, still the same green as Evelyn remembered, filled with tears she didn't shed. "Because I was protecting you. Both of you. From a truth that would have destroyed your lives." "What truth?" Her mother looked past her to where Boone stood guard over the disarmed sentry, then back to Evelyn's face. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of nearly 10 years of carefully guarded secrets. "The truth about who your father really was, and why Lane Morrison would have killed you both if he'd ever learned you were his family." The final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place, and Evelyn wasn't sure she was ready for the impact. Eleanor Carter sat back down in her chair, gesturing for Evelyn to take the seat across from her. The small cabin felt cramped with 4 people inside, but neither Boone nor the captured guard made any move to leave. Some stories demanded witnesses, and this was clearly one of them. "Your father wasn't a traveling merchant who died of fever." Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "He was Sheriff Marcus Morrison, Lane's father." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. She'd suspected some connection between Lane and her family, but this was worse than anything she'd imagined. "That's impossible. Morrison died when Lane was just a boy." "He did," but not before he fathered 3 children by 2 different women. Eleanor's fingers twisted in her lap, working at fabric that wasn't there. Lane by his wife, Martha, who died giving birth. You and Toby by me, the woman he kept as his mistress in the old mining camp outside town. You're saying Lane is our half-brother. More than that. When Marcus died, Lane inherited everything, the Morrison name, the property, the position of respect in the community. But he also inherited his father's secrets, including the knowledge that he wasn't the only child. Eleanor looked up, meeting her daughter's eyes directly. Lane grew up knowing about you and Toby, but not who you were. Marcus had been careful to keep his 2 lives separate. Evelyn felt the room spinning around her as the implications sank in. When did he find out? The night before I supposedly died of fever. He came to our cabin with proof letters Marcus had written to me, documents about the money he'd been sending to support you children. Lane was already deputy by then, working for Curtis, and he'd been investigating his father's papers. What did he want? At first, just acknowledgement. He wanted me to tell you and Toby who your real father was, wanted us to be a family. Eleanor's voice grew bitter. But when I refused, when I told him I'd rather die than burden my children with the shame of illegitimacy, he found another solution. He faked your death. He brought a body, some poor woman who died of fever in the camps, and had Doc Henderson identify it as mine. Then he brought me here, told everyone I was his housekeeper, a widow from back east. Said I was taking care of his property while he worked in town. The captured guard, who'd been listening with growing horror, finally found his voice. Jesus Christ, ma'am. You've been here 9 years. 9 years, 3 months, and 6 days. Eleanor's smile was sharp as a knife blade. Not that I've been counting. Evelyn felt rage building in her chest, hot and clean and consuming. Why didn't you escape? Why didn't you try to contact us? Because he threatened to kill you both if I did. Lane made it very clear that my compliance was the price of your safety. Eleanor reached across the small table and took her daughter's hands. And because I knew that someday you'd be strong enough to come for me. The desert woman always comes when she's needed most. That story, the legend about the woman who saved the town, was about your great-grandmother, Sarah Desert Rose. She was Comanche, married to a Mexican settler who worked the silver mines. When the drought came, she used her knowledge of the land to find water and save everyone's lives. Eleanor squeezed Evelyn's hands. I named you after her strength, hoped you'd inherit her courage. It seems I was right. Boone, who'd been standing silent guard by the door, finally spoke. Ma'am, with respect, we need to leave. The cavalry will be searching for us, and there's still the matter of the other prisoners. What other prisoners? Eleanor asked. The Crimson Rose Consortium. Lane was part of a network that kidnapped and sold women across 3 territories. Evelyn pulled out the leather satchel, showing her mother the ledger and documents inside. We have proof, but we need to get this information to the authorities. Eleanor's face went white. Dear God, I knew he was involved in something terrible, but I thought it was just corruption, embezzlement. I never imagined. How many women have been through here? Boone asked quietly. Dozens. They kept them for a few days, sometimes a week, before moving them on. I tried to help when I could, extra food, medicine, comfort, but Lane made sure I could never do enough to make a real difference. The weight of it all, the years of suffering, the lives destroyed, the families torn apart, settled on Evelyn's shoulders like a mountain of stone. But beneath the crushing weight was something else. The fierce satisfaction of knowing that Lane Morrison was dead, that his network was exposed, that justice would finally be served. Can you travel? She asked her mother. I've been dreaming of leaving this place for 9 years. Yes, I can travel. Then we go now, while we still have darkness to cover us. Evelyn turned to the captured guard. You have a choice. Come with us and testify about what you've seen here, or stay and try to explain to the cavalry why you were guarding prisoners for a criminal conspiracy. The young man, barely out of his teens, she realized, nodded quickly. I'll come. I'll tell them everything. I never wanted to hurt anybody, I just needed the money. What's your name? Billy Garrett. Tom Garrett's boy. Evelyn remembered Tommy Garrett, one of her students, always bringing home stories of his older brother who'd gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd. Your little brother's been worried about you, Billy. Is he okay? Is Tommy okay? He's fine. Brave as a lion, actually. Helped us fight Lane's men in town. Billy's face crumpled with relief and shame. I'll make it right, Miss Carter. I swear I'll make it right. They gathered what supplies they could carry and set out into the night, 4 figures moving through the darkness toward an uncertain future. Behind them, the cabin stood empty for the first time in nearly a decade. Its bars and locks no longer needed to contain the woman who'd been imprisoned there. But as they walked, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal wasn't over yet. The Crimson Rose Consortium was larger than just Lane Morrison and Sheriff Curtis. The ledger made that clear. There would be more fights ahead, more battles to win before justice was truly served. For now, though, it was enough that her mother was free, that the truth was finally known, and that the desert woman had indeed returned when her people needed her most. The hardest part was behind them. Ahead lay the work of rebuilding, of healing, of creating something better from the ashes of corruption and lies. Ahead lay home. Dawn found them at the old watchtower on Sentinel Ridge, the stone structure that had once guarded the approach to Perdition Creek's silver mines. From here they could see the town spread out below them in the valley, smoke rising from chimneys, people moving about their morning business as if the world hadn't been fundamentally changed in the space of a single day. Boone sat with his back against the tower wall, his breathing shallow but steady. The climb from Hawks Canyon had cost him dearly, but he'd insisted on maintaining watch through the night, his experienced eyes scanning the trails for any signs of pursuit. Now, with daylight revealing the extent of his injuries, it was clear he wouldn't be going much further without medical attention. We should signal the town, Eleanor suggested, pointing to the mirror Billy had found among the watchtower's abandoned equipment. Let them know we're here. Not yet, Evelyn replied, studying the ledger one more time. There's still something I don't understand. The consortium's operations were too sophisticated, too well connected to be run by men like Lane and Curtis. Someone else was giving orders, someone with access to federal officials and interstate transportation. She flipped through the pages, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might reveal the organization's true leadership. What she found made her blood run cold. Every major transaction, every shipment of human cargo, every bribe paid to corrupt officials bore the same authorization signature, a stylized rose drawn in red ink. But it wasn't just a symbol. It was a name rendered in flowing script beneath the flower. Rose Henderson. No, she whispered, staring at the signature. It can't be. What is it? Her mother asked, moving closer to see the ledger. Henderson, the shopkeeper. He's been working with them all along. Evelyn felt sick as the implications crashed over her. He knew about our plan from the beginning. When I told him about copying the ledger, when I asked him to send telegrams to the territorial authorities, he was feeding information back to the consortium. Boone finished grimly. Which means they know exactly what evidence we have, and they'll do anything to keep it from reaching the wrong hands. Billy Garrett, who'd been unusually quiet during their journey, suddenly spoke up. Miss Carter, there's something I got to tell you. About Henderson. All eyes turned to the young man who was wringing his hands nervously. He came to see Lane the day before yesterday. Had a long talk about moving operations, shutting down everything in Perdition Creek. What else? Evelyn demanded. He said the federal boys were getting too close, that they needed to eliminate loose ends. He had a list of names, people who knew too much, who needed to be dealt with. Billy's voice dropped to a whisper. Your name was on that list, Miss Carter. Yours and your brother's. Then Toby's still in danger, Eleanor said urgently. If Henderson is still down there, he'll try to finish what Lane started. Evelyn closed the ledger and stuffed it back into the satchel. We have to warn them. But even as she spoke, movement in the valley below caught her attention. A group of riders was leaving Perdition Creek, heading north toward the Territorial Road, at a pace that suggested urgent business. Through the watchtower's old spyglass, she could make out Henderson's distinctive buggy in the center of the group, surrounded by armed men she didn't recognize. He's running, she breathed. Henderson's abandoning the town. Good riddance, Billy said. Let him go. You don't understand. He's not just running, he's moving his assets. Evelyn adjusted the spyglass, focusing on the heavily loaded wagons bringing up the rear of the convoy. Those aren't supply wagons, they're prison wagons. The horror of it hit her like a physical blow. Henderson hadn't just been coordinating the consortium's operations in Perdition Creek, he'd been using his general store as a front for the entire regional network. The goods he imported and exported weren't merchandise at all, but human cargo. And now, with his cover blown, he was evacuating his inventory before the federal authorities could intervene. How many? Boone asked quietly. I can see 3 wagons, maybe 4. Could be anywhere from 12 to 30 women. Evelyn handed him the spyglass. They're heading for the main road. Once they reach it, they could disappear into any of 100 different destinations. Then we stop them here. We. Eleanor looked at her daughter with alarm. Evelyn, you've done enough. Let the authorities handle this. The authorities don't know Henderson's involved. By the time they figure it out, those women will be gone forever. Evelyn checked her father's old pistol, the one she'd taken from their cabin, before beginning this desperate journey. I won't let that happen. Against 20 armed men, that's suicide. Not if we're smart about it. Evelyn studied the terrain below her teacher's mind, automatically cataloging advantages and disadvantages. The road passes through Devil's Narrows, about 2 miles north of here. It's the perfect place for an ambush if we can get there first. Even if we could reach the Narrows in time, even if we could stop the convoy, what then? We can't fight 20 men and protect 30 prisoners at the same time. We don't fight them. We turn them against each other. Evelyn smiled grimly. Henderson's men are mercenaries, not believers. They're only loyal as long as he can pay them. But if they think he's leading them into a trap, if they believe he's expendable, they might just decide to cut their losses. Boone finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. Save themselves by delivering Henderson to the authorities. Exactly. But it has to be done right, and it has to be done fast. Eleanor grabbed her daughter's arm. I just got you back, Evelyn. I can't lose you again. You won't. Evelyn covered her mother's hand with her own. The desert woman always comes home, remember? That's how the story ends. But even as she spoke the words, Evelyn knew that some stories didn't have the endings people expected. Some stories required sacrifices, that no one wanted to make choices that left scars on the soul, even in victory. Looking down at Henderson's convoy disappearing into the distance, she realized that the final chapter of their ordeal was about to be written in blood and dust among the rocks of Devil's Narrows. Whether it would be a story of triumph or tragedy, depended on the next few hours, and on whether the lessons of courage and sacrifice her great-grandmother had taught were strong enough to overcome the brutal mathematics of violence and greed. The desert woman was about to face her greatest test. Devil's Narrows lived up to its name. The road squeezed between two towering walls of red sandstone, barely wide enough for a single wagon to pass safely. It was a natural bottleneck, a place where geography itself became a weapon in the right hands. More importantly, it was the only route to the territorial road that didn't require a 2-day detour through hostile Apache territory. Henderson would have to come this way. He had no choice. Evelyn crouched behind a boulder on the eastern rim, checking her father's pistol one more time. Below her, Boone had positioned himself among the rocks on the western side, despite his wounds making every movement an act of will. They'd left Eleanor and Billy at the watchtower with strict instructions to signal the cavalry if the plan went wrong. The plan, such as it was. "Remember," she called softly across the narrow gap. "We're not trying to win a gunfight. We're trying to start a panic." "Understood," Boone replied, his voice carrying clearly in the confined space. "Soon as the shooting starts, Henderson's men will look for cover. That's when you make your speech. If I live long enough to make it, you will." His confidence was absolute, unshakable. "Desert woman, remember." The sound of approaching wheels echoed off the canyon walls, growing louder with each passing moment. Henderson's convoy was moving slower now, the drivers careful on the treacherous road, the guards alert for trouble. They knew this was a perfect spot for an ambush, which made them exactly as paranoid as Evelyn needed them to be. The first wagon appeared around the bend, loaded with supplies and legitimate merchandise, Henderson's cover story for anyone who might question his cargo. Then came the man himself, riding in his familiar buggy with 2 armed guards, flanking him on horseback. He looked older than she remembered, grayer, his face lined with the stress of maintaining his double life for so many years. Behind him came the prison wagons, their human cargo hidden beneath canvas covers, but audible as soft voices and the rattle of chains. Evelyn's heart clenched as she heard a woman crying, probably no older than herself, stolen from her family and sold like livestock to feed the consortium's insatiable greed. "Now," she whispered. Her first shot wasn't aimed at any person. It struck the rocks above the lead wagon, sending a shower of stone fragments cascading down on the horses. The animals reared and plunged, blocking the narrow road as their driver fought to control them. Boone's rifle cracked from across the canyon, and one of Henderson's guards toppled from his saddle with a cry of pain and shock. "Ambush!" someone screamed. "We're trapped!" Chaos erupted in the confined space. Horses reared, men shouted conflicting orders, and the prison wagons lurched to a halt as their drivers sought whatever cover they could find. Several guards fired wild shots at the canyon rims, but they couldn't see their attackers clearly enough to aim effectively. In the confusion, Henderson stood up in his buggy, trying to restore order. "Calm down, you idiots. There's only 2 of them." "That you know of," Evelyn called down, her voice echoing strangely in the narrow space. "How do you know this isn't a trap, Henderson? How do you know your partners haven't decided you're expendable?" The effect was immediate and gratifying. Several of Henderson's mercenaries turned suspicious eyes on their employer, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. In a criminal organization, paranoia was always just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to boil over. "Don't listen to her," Henderson shouted. "She's trying to divide us." "Am I?" Evelyn kept her voice calm, reasonable, the tone she used in the classroom when explaining difficult concepts. "Then why did you leave town without telling your men about the federal warrants? Why didn't you mention that the territorial marshal has copies of the Crimson Rose ledger?" She was bluffing about the warrants, but the reaction from Henderson's face told her the shot had hit home. Several of his men were now looking openly hostile, and she pressed her advantage. Ask him about the insurance policy, boys. Ask him about the deal he made to save his own skin. What's she talking about, Henderson? One of the guards demanded, his rifle now pointed as much at his employer as at the canyon rims. What deal? There is no deal. Henderson's voice cracked with strain. She's lying. Then why are you the only one with a federal marshal's badge in your pocket? That was pure invention, but it had the desired effect. The mercenaries' suspicion crystallized into open mutiny as they realized their leader might have been playing both sides against the middle. In their world, betrayal was the ultimate sin, and the punishment for it was swift and final. You son of a bitch! One of the guards snarled, swinging his rifle toward Henderson. You sold us out. No, I never. The gunshot that cut off Henderson's protest came not from Evelyn or Boone, but from one of his own men. The shopkeeper crumpled forward in his buggy, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped through his fingers. Around him, his mercenaries were abandoning their positions, some fleeing deeper into the canyon, while others began freeing the women from the prison wagons. Don't shoot. The guard who'd wounded Henderson called up to the canyon rims. We surrender. We'll testify against the whole damn consortium if you guarantee us protection. Evelyn remained hidden, knowing that showing herself too soon might reignite the violence. Free the women first, all of them. You heard her, the guard shouted to his companions. Get those chains off now. What followed was organized chaos, as nearly 24 women emerged from the prison wagons, blinking in the harsh desert sunlight, many of them barely able to walk after days or weeks of confinement. Some were girls from Perdition Creek that Evelyn recognized, others were strangers from distant towns, all united by the horror of what they'd endured. But they were alive. They were free, and they would go home. As the last of the chains were removed and the women helped to safety, Evelyn finally emerged from her hiding place, climbing down the canyon wall, with her father's pistol still in her hand. Henderson lay in his buggy wounded, but conscious, his face gray with pain and defeat. It's over, she told him quietly. The Crimson Rose Consortium is finished. You think so? Henderson managed a weak smile through his pain. You have no idea how deep this goes, schoolmarm. How many important people have been taking our money using our services. Kill me, arrest me, it doesn't matter. There will always be another Henderson, another Lane Morrison. Maybe, Evelyn admitted. But there will also always be people willing to fight them. People who refuse to accept that evil is inevitable. She looked around at the freed women, at the mercenaries, who'd chosen redemption over loyalty to a corrupt cause, at Boone climbing down from his position despite his wounds. They'd won more than just a battle. They'd proven that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary evil and triumph. The desert woman always comes when she's needed most, she said softly. And she never comes alone. In the distance, dust clouds on the horizon marked the approach of the territorial cavalry, finally arriving to secure the evidence and arrest the survivors. Justice would be served, families would be reunited, and the long work of healing could begin. But for Evelyn Carter, standing in the harsh beauty of Devil's Narrows, with her father's pistol in her hand and the ledger of the Crimson Rose Consortium in her satchel, the moment held a deeper meaning. She had become the woman her mother had raised her to be, the inheritor of her great-grandmother's courage, the latest in a long line of strong women who refused to let darkness triumph over light. The desert woman had returned, and she had brought justice with her. 3 months later, Perdition Creek barely resembled the dying frontier town it had been before the Crimson Rose Consortium's fall. The Lucky Strike mine was operating under new management with fair wages and safe working conditions enforced by federal oversight. The main street bustled with legitimate commerce as traveling merchants and settlers began to see the town as something more than a way station to somewhere better. Evelyn stood on the schoolhouse steps, watching her students practice their letters on slate boards in the afternoon sun. Tommy Garrett was helping his younger classmates, his brother Billy, having returned from his testimony at the territorial trials, to work as the town's new deputy marshal. The Garrett family had been through hell, but they'd emerged stronger and more united than before. "Miss Sheriff?" Tommy called out, grinning at the title that still made Evelyn uncomfortable. "Mary Patterson wants to know if you'll tell us the story about the desert woman again." "It's Sheriff Carter," she corrected gently, though she was smiling. "And which story about the desert woman?" "The one about how she saved all those women from the bad men." Mary Patterson piped up her mother's fierce independence, already visible in her 8-year-old features. "And how she made the town safe again." Evelyn settled on the school steps, gathering the children around her, as she'd done so many times before. But now the stories she told carried the weight of lived experience, of battles fought and won, of prices paid and justice served. "Well," she began, "the desert woman understood that real strength doesn't come from violence or fear. It comes from people choosing to stand together even when they're afraid, even when the odds seem impossible." As she spoke, she was aware of other listeners gathering at the edges of the group. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had died fighting Lane Morrison's men, but who'd stayed in Perdition Creek to help rebuild. Morrison himself, the blacksmith, whose daughter had been one of the women rescued from Henderson's wagons. Even some of the former prisoners who'd chosen to make new lives in the town, rather than return to places that held too many painful memories. They were all part of the story now, all threads in the tapestry of survival and renewal that Perdition Creek had become. "But Sheriff," Tommy interrupted, "what happened to Boone Mackenzie? Ma says he just disappeared one day." Evelyn's smile faltered slightly. Boone had indeed disappeared, slipping away 3 weeks after the final trials, while he was still recovering from his wounds. She'd found only a brief note on her desk. "Some debts can't be paid in courtrooms. Thanks for showing me another way." B. She'd tried to track him down, but Boone Mackenzie had vanished as completely as if the desert had swallowed him whole. Sometimes she caught herself scanning the horizon, hoping to see a familiar figure riding toward town, but hope she'd learned was something you held lightly, ready to let go when necessary. "Sometimes people have to follow their own paths," she told Tommy. "The important thing is that he helped save the town when it needed saving." "Will he come back?" "I don't know. Maybe someday." What she didn't tell the children was that Boone's departure hadn't been the end of his war against the Crimson Rose Consortium. Reports had reached her from across the territory. Safe houses raided corrupt officials, exposed women, freed from camps and factories where they'd been held against their will. The work was dangerous, probably fatal in the long run, but it was work that needed doing. And Boone Mackenzie had always been a man who did what needed doing, regardless of the cost to himself. "Sheriff Carter." Mary Patterson raised her hand. "Is your mama really alive? Tommy says she came back from the dead." She was never dead, just hidden away where bad men couldn't use her to hurt the people she loved. Evelyn glanced toward the small house on Elm Street, where Eleanor Carter was hanging laundry in the afternoon breeze, finally living the quiet life she'd been denied for so many years. "She's very much alive and very happy to be home." The reunion with her mother had been everything she'd dreamed of, and nothing like she'd expected. There had been tears, yes, and long conversations that lasted deep into the night. But there had also been the practical work of rebuilding lives that had been shattered, of learning to trust again, of figuring out how to be a family after so many years of separation. Eleanor had adapted to freedom with the same quiet strength she'd shown in captivity, She'd taken over as the town's unofficial doctor, her years of tending to injured prisoners having given her medical skills that were desperately needed in a frontier community. She'd also become the unofficial keeper of the town's new history, documenting the stories of the women who'd been rescued and helping them reconnect with their families. "And your brother?" Tommy pressed. "Is Toby coming back too?" That was a more complicated question. Toby had indeed survived the ordeal, but the experience had changed him in ways that were still becoming clear. He'd taken a job with the Territorial Marshal Service, working to track down the remaining members of the consortium network. Like Boone, he seemed driven by a need to ensure that what had happened in Perdition Creek could never happen again. "Toby's doing important work," she said carefully. "He'll visit when he can." The children seemed satisfied with that answer, and gradually they drifted back to their lessons, leaving Evelyn alone on the schoolhouse steps with her thoughts. The afternoon was peaceful, almost idyllic, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their respite was temporary. Evil hadn't been defeated, merely disrupted. Somewhere in the vast expanse of the American West, new predators were taking the place of the old ones. New schemes were being hatched to exploit the vulnerable and innocent. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, Perdition Creek was safe. Her students were learning, and her family was whole again. Today was enough. A rider appeared on the eastern trail, silhouetted against the setting sun. For a moment, Evelyn's heart leaped with the hope that it might be Boone returning from his self-imposed exile. But as the figure drew closer, she recognized the uniform of a territorial marshal. The rider dismounted at the schoolhouse, tipping his hat respectfully. "Sheriff Carter, I have a message for you." She took the sealed envelope with hands that trembled slightly. Official correspondence still made her nervous, a reminder of how much her life had changed in such a short time. But this message bore a personal seal rather than an official one, and the handwriting on the outside was hauntingly familiar. "Thank you, Marshal." Any reply needed? "No, ma'am. I was just told to deliver it into your hands personally." After the marshal rode away, Evelyn opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, bearing a brief message written in the same careful script she remembered from her childhood. "My dearest Evelyn, the work continues, but so does hope. Know that you and your family are always in my thoughts, and that the legacy of the Desert Woman lives on in everything you do. The enclosed will help you understand what still needs to be done. Trust no one completely, but never stop believing that good people can triumph over evil. Your loving father's friend, R." Enclosed with the letter was a map of the Western Territories, marked with locations and dates that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Dozens of sites from California to Colorado, all bearing the same symbol, a crimson rose. The consortium's reach had been far wider than anyone had imagined, and despite their victory in Perdition Creek, the network was still largely intact. At the bottom of the map, in the same careful handwriting, was a final note. "The woman you seek is in Sacramento. She has been waiting for 20 years. Evelyn stared at the map until the sun disappeared behind the western mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there beyond the safe boundaries of Perdition Creek, her work was far from finished. There were more women to save more families, to reunite more battles, to fight against an enemy that seemed to have tentacles reaching into every corner of the frontier. But she was no longer the frightened schoolteacher who'd bargained desperately for her brother's life. She was Sheriff Evelyn Carter, keeper of the Peace Protector, of the innocent inheritor of a legacy that stretched back through generations of strong women who'd refused to let darkness triumph. She folded the map carefully and tucked it into her jacket. Tomorrow she would study it more closely, would begin planning the next phase of a war that might never truly end. But tonight she would go home to her mother, would sit by the fire and listen to stories of their ancestors, would prepare herself for whatever challenges lay ahead. The desert woman's story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. And in the distance, barely visible against the star-filled sky, a lone rider paused on a hilltop overlooking the town. Boone Mackenzie touched the brim of his hat in a silent salute, then turned his horse westward and disappeared into the night, carrying his own war to new battlefields where justice was needed most. Some stories, Evelyn reflected, never really ended. They just continued, carried forward by new voices, new heroes, new women who refused to let hope die in the darkness. The desert woman would always return when she was needed most, and she would never come alone.